All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into something that's absolutely critical for anyone involved in the world of construction, how you actually go about getting a building project done.
The nuts and bolts, the strategy, the process.
Exactly, we're talking about procurement strategy, essentially the game plan for choosing the team and the process to deliver a building and to guide us through this complex world.
We've got a great resource, actually.
Yeah.
The RICS Practice Information Document.
Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors.
Exactly, that's it. And this is the second edition from August 2024, so it's nice and up to date.
Fresh off the press.
And the RICS are a well-respected authority in the industry.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a solid foundation to be working from.
Absolutely.
So what we really want to achieve today is to kind of unpack this RICS document and pull out the most important insights, for anyone who wants to develop a really strong procurement strategy.
The meat and potatoes.
Yeah, and be able to pick the right route for their specific project. We want to give you a clear understanding of all the options and how to make the best decisions without getting bogged down in all the technical jargon.
Cutting through the noise.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's worth clarifying right up front that we're focusing on the high-level strategy here, choosing the right procurement route. We won't be getting into the really detailed specifics of, the tendering process itself or the ins and outs of all the different types of construction contracts.
Right.
Think of those as maybe follow-up deep dives.
Yeah, deeper dives for another day.
Definitely.
Now, the RICS document very helpfully breaks things down in a really logical way.
It does, step by step.
So we're going to follow that structure. It starts with the general principles, the foundational knowledge, then moves into the practical application, how you actually go about doing this. And then finally, it looks at practical considerations, the advising stage.
Yeah, it's like a roadmap for us.
It is. It is. And the really crucial thing that runs through all of this is, alignment. That the best procurement strategy for any project
Has to be a perfect fit.
is always going to be the one that really aligns with the client's specific goals, the level of risk they're comfortable with, and any limitations they might have on budget or time or resources.
Yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all magic bullet solution.
There isn't. And it's so important to remember, and the document highlights this, that a building project isn't just a standalone event. It's part of this much longer lifespan of a facility.
A whole life cycle.
Thinking about sustainability and the long-term performance
Has to be baked in.
needs to be baked in right from this initial strategic thinking.
From the outset, yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think it's also worth adding that the procurement strategy you choose will directly shape the team that you end up with. The roles that everyone plays and where the responsibilities lie.
Right.
It sets the tone for the entire project journey.
It does. It's like the DNA of the project in a way.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, so let's dig into these foundational principles.
Yeah.
That knowing level. I think the first thing to really grasp is that there isn't just one single way to get a construction project off the ground.
Oh, absolutely not. There's a whole buffet of procurement routes available.
A buffet, yeah.
And each one comes with, as you'd expect, its own set of characteristics, its own potential benefits, its own potential drawbacks, and crucially, each route distributes risk in different ways.
So with all these options on the table, how do you even begin to figure out which one is going to be the right fit for a particular project?
Well, the RICS document emphasizes that it all starts with a really thorough process of understanding, really getting to grips with everything. You need to identify every single factor that could potentially influence the project and then, really analyze the specific needs and requirements.
Like due diligence, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. A deep dive into the project.
It is a deep dive. And one of the big distinctions between these different routes is how they handle the design of the building versus the actual construction, right?
Absolutely. So some routes will keep those two phases quite separate.
Fixed and state, yeah.
Often involving different organizations and with limited interaction early on, maybe.
Right.
Whereas other routes, they really try to push for integration and collaboration between the design team and the construction team right from the outset.
So you really have to weigh up those advantages and disadvantages of keeping those things separate versus bringing them together early on.
You do.
Yeah.
And it's not just about picking the method that you're most familiar with or that you've always done in the past.
Right.
The document makes a really good point, actually, that the route that seems the most obvious initially might not actually be the best one when you really look at the bigger picture, the long-term implications.
Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. What are some of the key ways these common procurement routes actually differ in practice?
Well, I think a major thing to consider is the client's financial risk.
Right.
Some routes will mean the client carries more of the financial burden if things go wrong, if things don't go exactly to plan, whereas others will shift more of that financial risk over to the contractor.
That makes sense. So what else is important to be looking at?
Well, the level of control that the client maintains, both over the design of the project and the actual construction process, can vary quite a bit.
Okay.
Some routes give the client a lot of say throughout all the stages,
Right.
whereas others will involve more delegation of authority.
And what about the design itself? How does the stage that the design has reached actually impact the choice of procurement route?
Yeah, so the point at which the design information is finalized relative to when you go out to tender, that's another really key difference. In some routes, the design will be very detailed and complete before you even get contractor bids, whereas in others, the design's more conceptual at that stage.
And that, I can imagine, would have a big impact on when you can actually start turning soil and begin construction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The amount of design information you need to have nailed down before you can realistically start construction work will differ depending on the route you've chosen.
Right. So some need a fully detailed blueprint, whereas others allow for more of a phased approach.
Exactly.
Now, what about the people who are actually going to be building the thing? The main contractors and their supply chain, all the subcontractors.
Yeah, boots on the ground.
Yeah. When do they typically get brought into the process?
That's another really critical factor.
Yeah.
So the degree to which the main contractor and their supply chain get involved in the design stage can vary a lot.
Right.
Sometimes getting their practical construction expertise involved early on can actually lead to more buildable and cost-effective designs.
Makes sense. And then ultimately, if something does go wrong during the project, who carries the can?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the way that risk, responsibility, and accountability are allocated, it's a fundamental characteristic of each route.
Right.
You need to be really clear on who is ultimately responsible for what.
Absolutely. And it sounds like some of the routes are very much linear, one step after the other, whereas others might allow for a bit more overlapping of the different project phases.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. So that's the difference between what we call a sequential process, where one phase largely finishes before the next begins, versus a parallel process, where you're trying to run design and construction activities concurrently to try and speed things up.
To make things more efficient.
Exactly.
And obviously, all of these factors must have a pretty significant impact on the overall timeline for the project.
Absolutely. The total timescale implications can be quite different depending on the route you select.
Right.
And often, clients will have a target completion date in mind, and that can sometimes lead them to choose a route that isn't actually the most suitable in the long run.
Because they're just so focused on speed.
Exactly.
Now, it seems like there's a growing trend towards clients wanting to work more collaboratively, more closely with their construction teams.
Yeah, definitely. The document highlights that experienced clients are increasingly looking to build more integrated project teams.
Okay.
So this might be through setting up long-term framework agreements with trusted partners, or through specific partnering arrangements focused on a series of projects, all aimed at trying to create a more collaborative and mutually beneficial way of working.
So when clients are kind of first starting to wrap their heads around all of this, what are those absolute initial things they need to be thinking about?
Well, the RICS document, it emphasizes that you need to focus on 4 key areas right from the start.
Okay, lay them on me.
All right, so we have
What's
function.
the building actually meant to do?
Exactly, what's its purpose? Then there's cost, obviously, what's the budget?
Right.
Then time, what's the required schedule? When does it need to be finished by? And finally, the risks associated with each of those things.
Right, the 4 pillars.
Yeah, those are the fundamental pillars that everything else hangs on.
And how do clients typically prioritize those different aspects?
Well, Figure 1 in the document gives us a nice little visual representation of typical client priorities throughout the life cycle of a project. So initially, the main focus is often on performance.
Making sure it does what it's supposed to do.
Exactly. Then the emphasis often shifts to the cost of the project.
Okay.
Following that, the focus tends to be on the time it will take to complete. And then once the project's actually finished, handed over, the primary concern often circles back to that long-term performance. How's the building actually operating?
That makes sense. That progression makes intuitive sense. Now, the document briefly touches on the differences between public and private sector procurement.
Yeah, slightly different worlds.
They are. And while our focus today is on the general principles that apply to both, are there any really key differences worth mentioning?
Yeah, the document makes the point that Public sector procurement often operates within a different framework, compared to the private sector, where the primary driver might be just, value for money in a more commercial sense. Public procurement is usually governed by specific regulations and guidance, which we won't go into detail on today.
Right.
But it's something to be aware of.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start looking at some of these specific procurement routes in a bit more detail. So the first one up is what's often described as the traditional or lump sum approach.
Yeah, the old faithful.
This sounds like a really common method.
It is. It is indeed. It's often the default choice, particularly for clients who are relatively new to the world of construction. And it's generally seen as, a lower risk option, offering that predictability around the design, the cost, and the overall duration of the project, provided it's managed correctly, of course.
Always caveats.
Of course, always caveats.
And what's the typical sort of step-by-step process with this traditional route?
It's a very sequential process.
Oh.
So typically the design is completed in its entirety. All the drawings, all the specifications, before any competitive tenders are invited from contractors.
Right.
And before the main construction contract is awarded. Think of it like getting the full recipe before you ask any chefs to quote you on cooking the meal.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
So the client hires the architects and engineers, the design team, first.
Exactly. So the client will usually select and appoint the architects, the structural engineers, the mechanical and electrical consultants, and any other necessary design professionals, based on their expertise, their fees, or a combination of those factors.
The best fit for the job.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once that whole design package is complete, they start looking for a contractor to actually build it.
That's the next stage.
Yeah.
The client will typically go out to tender, inviting bids from a number of contractors, and the contractors generally selected based on what they call best value, which, as the document rightly points out, doesn't always mean simply the lowest price.
Right.
Factors like experience, track record, the proposed methodology, they're all considered.
So it's a holistic assessment.
It should be, yeah.
And with a lump sum contract, how is that total cost of the project actually determined?
So, assuming there are no significant changes made to the agreed design,
Right.
the construction costs can be established with a reasonable level of certainty before any physical work even begins on site.
Okay.
And that predictability can be a big draw for clients who have, maybe strict budget limitations or borrowing constraints.
Right. So those tender documents that go out to potential contractors, what sort of information do they usually contain?
So they should include a comprehensive set of drawings that detail the design, along with a written specification that outlines the required quality of workmanship and the types of materials to be used.
Okay.
Often, the client will also appoint a quantity surveyor.
A construction cost expert.
Exactly, to prepare a bill of quantities.
Okay.
So this is essentially a detailed list of all the different elements of work involved in the project, along with estimated quantities for each one.
Right.
And this helps to ensure that all the contractors who are bidding are pricing based on the exact same scope of work, making it a more like-for-like comparison.
So everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, in theory.
So in this traditional setup, who takes on the main risks if things don't go according to plan during construction?
Well, generally the contractor assumes the primary responsibility and the financial risk for constructing the building in accordance with the client's design for that agreed lump sum price and within a specified time frame.
Okay.
But it's important to note that the client retains the responsibility and the risk for the design itself.
Right.
And for the performance of their appointed design team. So if there are errors or omissions in the design, that's typically on the client.
Right. So the contractor is responsible for building it correctly, but not for any underlying flaws in the design itself.
Exactly. They're essentially following the recipe. If the recipe's wrong, that's not their fault.
Makes sense. And what level of involvement does the client typically have during, both the design and the construction phases of a traditional project?
Well, clients usually have a pretty significant degree of influence during the design phase because they have that direct relationship with the architects and other design consultants. They can provide input, they can review drawings, they can approve design decisions. However, once the construction phase begins, their direct control over the day-to-day process is more limited. They'll typically exert their influence through their architect or maybe a project manager who acts as their representative on site.
Right. Ensuring the work's being done to the plans and specs.
Exactly.
So it sounds like sticking to that clear sequence, design complete, then tender, then build, is really key to maintaining that kind of lower risk profile that's associated with the traditional approach.
Absolutely. The document cautions that Trying to appoint a contractor before the design is fully finalized can lead to a whole host of post-contract changes,
Okay.
which can then snowball into delays and increase costs, ultimately undermining the very benefit that the traditional route is supposed to offer.
So it can be a bit of a false economy.
It can, yeah.
But there are ways to try and speed up that traditional process, aren't there?
Yes, there are definitely variations. So you have things like what's often called accelerated traditional procurement.
Okay.
And this involves trying to overlap some of the design and construction phases. For example, you might have a separate, early works contract for things like site clearance or foundation work while the detailed design for the main building is still being finalized.
Okay.
Or another approach is a two-stage tendering process, where a contractor is selected based on initial proposals before the design's completely finished. And then they work collaboratively with the design team on the final design and price.
So they're brought in earlier to kind of help refine those details.
Yeah, exactly.
But those accelerated approaches must come with their own kind of set of trade-offs, I imagine.
They do. Speeding up the process often introduces a higher level of risk and can mean sacrificing some of that early cost certainty that's a hallmark of the standard traditional route.
Right.
In the case of, say, separate early works, you can also create potential issues around who's responsible if, the foundation work done by one contractor doesn't quite align with the superstructure designed by another.
Ah, yeah.
Two-stage processes can also mean less certainty about the final price in exchange for getting started on site more quickly.
Right. So to kind of sum up this traditional lump sum approach, what are the main advantages you'd say for a client?
Well, I think the key benefits include competitive fairness in the tendering process because everyone is pricing against the same defined scope of work.
Okay.
It's a design-led approach where the client has good influence over the final design. You generally get a reasonable level of price certainty right at the point of contract award. It offers good public accountability, if that's a requirement.
Right.
The procedures and processes involved are generally well established and understood by the industry, and making changes during the project is relatively straightforward from a contractual perspective, although those changes will likely impact the agreed price and schedule.
And on the flip side, what are the main disadvantages that a client should be aware of?
Well, downsides can include a potentially longer overall project duration because of that sequential design then build process. There's typically limited or no input from the contractor and their specialist supply chain during that crucial design phase. The price-competitive nature of tendering can sometimes foster more adversarial relationships between the client and the contractor.
Right.
It might not be the most suitable approach for projects where the initial scope is poorly defined, as contractors may add, significant risk premiums to cover potential unknowns.
Makes sense.
And there's often limited incentive for the designers and the contractor to really focus on the long-term operational costs and efficiency of the building once it's completed.
They're just focused on getting it built to spec and on time and on budget.
Exactly.
Okay. So, moving on, we've got the traditional remeasurement or measure and value route.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful.
It is. This sounds like a variation on that traditional theme.
It is. As the name implies, instead of a fixed lump sum, this approach is based on actually measuring and then valuing the quantities of work that are completed on site using the unit prices that were submitted by the contractor in their tender.
Okay.
The RICS document does point out that it's becoming less common for traditional building projects these days, although it's still often used for civil engineering works, particularly where there's a high degree of uncertainty about things like ground conditions.
Right, because you can't quantify exactly how much work will be required until you actually start digging.
Exactly.
So unlike a lump sum, the final price isn't agreed upon and fixed right at the start.
That's right. The overall contract sum is only established with certainty once the project's fully finished, and the actual quantities of work carried out have been remeasured and then valued, using, essentially, the agreed schedule of rates that the contractor provided during the tender process.
Okay.
So in essence, the bill of quantities, in this scenario, acts more like a price list for different types of work.
Right. And in what kind of situations is this remeasurement approach typically most useful or appropriate?
It tends to be most effective when the overall design of the project is largely complete, but there might still be some final details that are yet to be fully resolved.
Okay.
So in those kinds of cases, going out to tender based on drawings and approximate quantities with contractors providing unit rates for those different elements can work quite well.
Right, so it allows the project to move forward without all the fine-grained details being absolute lockdown.
Precisely.
So it can potentially lead to some time savings in that pre-construction phase.
Yes, measurement contracts can potentially allow the client to shorten that overall program of design, tendering, and getting construction underway, because you don't need every last detail of the design finalized before going to tender.
Right.
However, this potential time saving usually comes at the expense of early price certainty, because those initial approximate quantities might not accurately reflect what ultimately gets built.
So there's that trade-off. Again, more risk for the client in terms of the final cost, but potentially some advantages in terms of the project timeline?
That's a good way to summarize it.
Okay.
While the overall scope of the project, an approximate total price, and a likely program duration should still be established at the contract stage,
Right.
the client is definitely taking on more financial risk compared to a traditional lump sum contract,
Okay.
because the final cost will depend on those measured quantities.
What about the way the project team is structured? Is the organizational setup similar to that standard traditional route?
It's exactly the same. So in a remeasurement contract, the client will still typically have separate contractual relationships. One with the design team, so architects, engineers, etc.,
Right.
and a separate one with the main contractor who'll be carrying out the works.
And what are the main sort of advantages that this remeasurement approach offers to a client?
Well, the advantages can include the potential for some time savings in that pre-construction phase, as we've already mentioned, as you don't need a fully detailed design to go to tender.
Right.
You also get competitive pricing based on those approximate quantities
Yeah.
and the tendered unit rates.
Okay.
Similar to the lump sum route, it offers a degree of public accountability where that's required.
Right.
And the procedures are generally well understood within the construction industry, particularly in the civil engineering sector. Making changes during the project can also be relatively straightforward. And there's some potential for starting construction work while the final design details are still being ironed out. And finally, it can sometimes prevent contractors from adding very high risk premiums into their bids to cover uncertainties,
Right.
because the payment is based on what's actually delivered.
Okay, so they're not having to kind of factor in all those unknowns.
Exactly.
And what are the key disadvantages that a client needs to be aware of with this approach?
I think the most significant drawback is the lack of firm price certainty early on.
Right.
So the final cost isn't actually known until the project is completed and everything's been measured.
Right. There's that uncertainty.
Yeah. Also, just like the traditional lump sum route,
Yeah.
there's no early involvement of the contractor or their supply chain in those initial design and planning stages.
Okay.
The price-dependent nature of the contract can still lead to, potential for disagreements, adversarial relationships, if not managed well.
Right.
And finally, if the underlying design isn't sufficiently developed at the tender stage, it could still lead to problems and delays later in the project program.
Okay, so you're not completely eliminating that risk of things going wrong or things being unclear later down the line.
They're not.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about design and build.
Yeah, this is a different beast.
This sounds like a significantly more integrated way of approaching a construction project.
It is. Under a design and build procurement route, a single contractor takes on the overall responsibility and the risk for both designing and constructing the entire project.
Okay.
This is typically done for a pre-agreed lump sum price, and because the design and construction processes are much more closely integrated, it often allows for an earlier start on site and can potentially reduce the overall project duration.
But there are different variations and levels of integration within the design and build approach, aren't there?
Absolutely. The RICS document outlines a whole spectrum of different design and build approaches. So at one end, you might have a contractor who's essentially given a very high-level brief of the client's needs and is then responsible for taking that from initial concept all the way through to a completed building.
A true turnkey solution.
Yeah, sometimes even including obtaining planning permission and securing funding.
Wow, so the client's basically handing over the keys to the kingdom.
In some instances, yeah. More commonly, though, the client will employ their own design team to carry out some initial design work and to prepare what's called a set of employer's requirements.
Okay.
And this document essentially outlines the client's key objectives, the performance criteria, and the functional needs for the building. The contractor then bids based on their ability to meet those requirements, develops the detailed design, and then carries out the construction.
So the client still sets the overall direction and
They
parameters.
do, yeah. There's also what's known as develop and construct, where the
Mhm.
client might develop the initial concept design quite significantly, and then a contractor is brought in to finalize the detailed design and undertake the construction. And finally, in some cases, a contractor might take over an existing design team that was initially appointed by the client through a process called novation.
Novation now, that sounds like it could have some interesting implications. Is that always a straightforward process?
Well, the document does note that designers can sometimes be a bit resistant to the novation process,
Right.
as it essentially transfers their design responsibility to the contractor.
I can see why there might be a bit of pushback there.
Yeah, so it's definitely something to be aware of and to manage carefully.
Okay. Now, I recall reading that design and build contractors sometimes have a slightly different kind of legal responsibility compared to designers working under a traditional contract.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Design and build contractors can have a legal duty to ensure that the building they provide is fit for its intended purpose.
Right.
So this is a higher legal standard than the duty of reasonable skill and care that architects and design consultants typically owe to their clients under a traditional procurement route. However, it's important to note that many design and build contracts might actually exclude this fitness for purpose obligation or try to limit it.
Right. So it's not a given.
It's not a given. And even then, some clients are increasingly insisting on it, often stating that their employer's requirements will take precedence in case of any discrepancies with the contractor's design proposals.
So it's a bit of a gray area, potentially.
It can be, yeah.
And that must have significant implications for things like insurance and the overall risk profile of the project.
Well, it certainly does. The document actually suggests that while some contractors might be willing to accept a fitness for purpose obligation,
Right.
clients and their advisors need to carefully consider the insurance implications and the financial capacity of the contractor to meet potential claims, under such a demanding standard.
Because if they're not financially robust enough to cover those potential liabilities, then it could be a disaster for the client.
Absolutely. It could be a recipe for disaster. It might actually be better value for the client to accept a slightly lower but more readily insurable level of liability.
Right. Go for that kind of middle ground.
Yeah. And furthermore, if some otherwise capable contractors are unwilling to take on that fitness for purpose risk, the client might end up limiting their pool of potential bidders, right?
Right. So they're actually narrowing their choices, potentially shooting themselves in the foot.
Exactly.
So design and build, it sounds like it offers a really broad spectrum in terms of how much the client is involved and the level of design input they have.
It does, yeah. It can range from a very hands-off, almost turnkey solution where the contractor takes the lead on everything,
Right.
to that develop and construct approach where the client has a much more detailed initial brief and maintains a greater degree of influence over those early design concepts.
Okay, so lots of flexibility within that design and build framework.
Definitely.
Now, what are the main sort of advantages that a client might see in choosing a design and build procurement route?
Well, I think the key advantages often include having a single point of contact and a single source of responsibility for both the design and the construction,
Okay.
which can significantly reduce the administrative burden on the client.
Yeah.
It also means a greater transfer of risk to that single contractor.
Right.
You also get the benefit of the constructor's, practical input into the design process much earlier on.
Okay.
And if the client's requirements are well defined from the outset, you can generally achieve price certainty before construction commences.
Right.
And finally, because design and construction activities can overlap, the total project time can often be reduced.
Okay, so there are a lot of potential pluses there.
There are, yeah.
And what about the potential drawbacks or disadvantages that a client should be aware of with design and build?
Well, the disadvantages can include the difficulty for clients in preparing a truly comprehensive and unambiguous set of employers' requirements at the beginning. The client needs to commit to a design concept relatively early in the process. Comparing bids from different design and build contractors can be challenging because they might be proposing quite different design solutions.
Right. Apples and oranges?
Yeah, it can be tricky. Unless the client hires separate design consultants to review the proposals, they might not get a thorough evaluation of the design quality.
Okay, so there's that risk of not really understanding what they're getting in terms of the quality of the design.
Yeah. Client-initiated changes after the contract is awarded can also become quite expensive.
Right.
Design liability is often limited by standard contract terms. There's a potential for compromise on the overall quality or aesthetic appeal if the contractor is primarily focused on meeting the functional requirements within a tight budget.
Right, cutting corners.
Yeah, potentially. And ultimately, the client relinquishes a certain degree of direct control over the detailed design and construction processes.
So there's a degree of trust involved there. Okay, let's move on to construction management. This sounds like a route where the client takes on a much more active role in managing the whole project.
That's a very accurate way to describe it. So under a construction management procurement route, the client doesn't allocate all the risk and responsibility to a single main contractor. Instead, they directly employ a professional design team, and they also separately engage a construction manager. This construction manager operates as a fee-earning professional, and their primary role is to manage, coordinate, and oversee both the design development and the construction activities on site.